So many of you would have seen this visual earlier in the Connects workshop when Dave Mawhinney gave his talk, right? This is sort of the essence of the lean startup. And when Dave went over the lean startup methodology, he would have shown you this visual, right? So you build what's often called an MAP, you measure people's reaction to that MAP, you learn from what you measure, and then you iterate. Except for Dave didn't call them MAPs, he called them MVPs, and he talked about a famous baseball player who was apparently a most valuable baseball player, right? You'll learn later in this that I don't call them MVPs, I call them MAPs, and I'll give you some context why. But this is sort of the essence of the lean startup methodology, and this is a visual that Dave, myself, and many others use. The other point that Dave made, right, was that there's nothing new under the sun. This has been around long before Eric wrote the Lean Startup book, and likely will continue to be popular even when some author comes behind Eric and Steve and writes their own version of kind of fundamentals of entrepreneurship. This is basically just the scientific method applied to innovation. However, I think there's one thing that's a little easy to miss about this visual, and that is that when you look at this, it kind of implies that a third of the time is spent building, a third of a startup's time is spent measuring, and a third of a startup's time is spent learning, and then you build the next thing. Yet many of you are working on startups right now, and you know this. In terms of the hours that are spent on a given startup at the earliest stages, way more than 50% of most startups' energy, budget, resources, time, that's going to go to the build phase. If you were going to try to sort of frame the same visual out, but frame it out where you're talking about, amount of time, it might be like build as 80% of the slide, measure as 20% of the slide, and just a little bit on the learning, because you tend to almost learn while you're measuring, right? On the other hand, if you were going to sort of try to, okay, let's weight these labels based on value to your startup, the reality is that most of the value actually comes from what you measure and learn, right? Because remember, most startups fail because they build something that no one wants, right? That was another theme that Dave's already talked to you about this semester. And so if you're going to do it based on value, then it might be like 20% of the value is in the building and 80% is in the measuring and learning. But I think what becomes important now is going back to that first one, the how much time you actually spend building. And what becomes important here is that if you're going to spend most of your time building, then two questions become really important. What do we build, right? So question one is just, okay, what are we going to build next? So being intentional about that. And then two, how do you predict how long it's going to take you to get through that next build, measure, learn loop? And remember, if 80% of the time comes in the building phase, that means the answer for calendar time on how much time it's going to take you to get through the next build, measure, learn cycle is mostly going to be found based on how long does it take you to build. And so we've got to figure out, what do you build? And then we've got to figure out, how do you predict how long it will take to build it? Because the reality is, if you're talking to investors, they're not going to talk about build, measure, learn cycles. They're going to talk about, I'm going to invest X dollars into your startup so that you have runway of a certain number of months. And I want to know what you can prove from that investment. Or if you're going to, for example, invest in, if you're going to, say you're like, no, I don't want to raise investment dollars at all, right? I want to bootstrap this. If that's what you want to do, you still are going to have people like family members. Maybe your significant other asks you like, well, how many more build, measure, learn cycles do you have before this thing starts making money? Nobody asks that. What they're going to ask you is, how long is it going to be until this starts making money? And so you need to translate this build, measure, learn loop into a timing. And so we'll get to later how using an Agile methodology like Scrum allows you to predict how much time you take. But before we get to that, let's go back to the first question, which is, what do you build? And when you're thinking about what do you build, sorry, that went to the wrong page. The question around what you build is often answered by the lean startup methodology's concept of this MVP, right? And again, this is a definition you've seen before, but let's just set the context here. I added the bracketed or service because I think one of the misconceptions is people think MVPs, or what I call MAPs, need to always be a product, and they just don't. But the thing when you're answering what do you build is you build a version of a product or service that allows you to collect the maximum amount of validated learning with the least amount of effort. So you want to ask yourself at any given time, how can I learn as much as I can about my customers with as little work as possible, right? And so to do that, right, you're going to build what's called an MVP or an MAP. But again, I don't call these MVPs because I realize that the term viable has been misconstrued way too much. And this leads to a broader setting that sort of gets to hopefully some new material building upon what Dave shared with you. I've learned that there's really 5 things that people tend to just misunderstand when they're talking about MVPs. And the first of them is that viable doesn't mean crappy. So I'll tell you a story about some entrepreneurs I worked with in Lisbon, Portugal. So I had this opportunity as part of the Kauffman Foundation to go on a trip which is called Silicon Valley Comes to Europe. I'm not from Silicon Valley, but basically it's just tech entrepreneurs from the United States go to Europe. And on that trip, I spent some time with 2 entrepreneurs in this office hours setting, which is basically just like office hours with your classes. You know, you sit down in 20 to 30 minute meetings with other people and talk about what the startup that you're working on. And if the conversation goes well, you can have deeper conversations. If it doesn't go well, it's only 20 minutes. So these 2 entrepreneurs came in for office hours with me, and these guys were lean startup fanboys, right? They'd read the book, they dog-eared and paperclipped the book. They were into it. I think they may have slept with the book under their pillow so that they could learn more by osmosis. Maybe that last part's an exaggeration, but you get the point, right? They were really into this. And as we were talking, I said, okay, well, tell me a little bit about your startup. And they said, okay, well, our startup idea is basically that we want to build software to make weddings better because weddings are just a terrible idea. And I was like, I don't know that I agree. Some folks on here have met my wife before. Probably one of the best things that ever happened was my wife saying yes to marrying me. So like, I'm not sure I agree with that. I should just tell you up front, I'm a big fan of marriage. I was trying to kind of maybe cut off a somewhat awkward conversation. They said, no. Being married is great, but the process of getting married is broken. And one interesting thing about me, or maybe it's not interesting, but at least one relevant fact about me is that Dave and I sold Peak Strategy to Morgan Stanley in the middle of me getting married, so while I was engaged. And so I was not that involved in the process of planning our wedding. So I don't know a lot about that. And I was like, that's interesting. They tell me why getting married is broken. And they said, well, here's the thing. You answer all these questions when you're getting married. And these questions are, to your partner, often they feel really important to him or her, but to you, they're just not that important. For example, and both of these guys had just gotten married and their wives were best friends. So their wives were in each other's wedding. They said, for example, both of us came home from work one day and our significant other, now our wife, said to us, look, we've got a really important decision to make tonight. This is super important. And so they're like, it'd been a long day, but we wanted to be engaged. It's like, okay, well, what's the really important question? And they said, the really important question is, do we put beige or off-white tissue paper inside the wedding invitation? And they said, here's the problem, Sean. From our perspective, which I don't think they said from their perspective, but they meant from their perspective, beige and off-white are the same color. And there's actually a bunch of interesting science about, generally how many colors men can see versus women and things like that. But I've told the story, probably hundreds of times at this point. I've come to find, telling it a lot, that apparently this is a common point for dispute between fiancés when they're getting married. And they said that we don't even know how to respond to a question like that. And then, so we would say something along the lines of, well, I don't care. And the problem, Sean, when you say I don't care is you're your fiance hears, oh, I don't care about our future together. I don't care about the children we're going to have. And so you end up getting into this big fight. I said, great. Makes sense to me. Again, not an experience I had, but intellectually that makes sense to me. So I said, okay, well, tell me how your software solves that. And they had some ideas. It was kind of like a base camp for planning your weddings. Plus they had this tool that helped pick the right tools. And it's like, okay, all of this generally makes sense at 30,000 feet at least. And I said, well, what was your MVP? Remember, these guys are lean startup fanboys, right? They've got the book, they've highlighted it. So I knew this was a safe question to ask them. And they said, oh, well, we built a landing page and we were trying to figure out, do we start with the product recommendation stuff or do we start with the project management stuff? And I was like, okay, that makes sense. And so we built a landing page. The landing page looks the same except for the text that we put on the page. And we wanted to see which audience would opt into more which, right? So if we drove Facebook ads to those two pages, same amount of traffic, which one would have a higher conversion rate? Again, a very classic test in the lean startup. I was like, okay, that makes sense. I said, well, which landing page converted better? And they paused and they looked at me and they said, well, no, this is the problem, is nobody signed up. And I was like, what do you mean nobody signed up? Because people sign up for everything on the internet. It's just kind of how it works. And they're like, yeah, nobody signed up. I said, well, were you charging for it? Oh, no, it was free. We'll always sign up for free stuff on the internet. I mean, we could do this right now. We could go to Facebook. We could buy an ad and drive people to a landing page that said, I'm a Somalian prince. Please give me your social security number. And I will send you, this for free back. And if you could drive enough traffic to that, people would sign up. I know you don't think that's true because you're all Carnegie Mellon students, but people sign up for just about everything on the internet. That's why, as crazy as all the spam stuff that you get is, the reason that stuff gets sent out is because it works. I was like, this just doesn't make sense. I'm thinking, well, they must have not sent enough traffic there. So I said, well, how much traffic did you send? Oh, we sent thousands of visitors to it. Okay, now I'm even more confused and concerned because frankly, if you send that kind of traffic to a page, you've spent, in dollars, thousands and thousands of dollars. They'd obviously spend it in euros, but thousands and thousands of dollars. They should have had conversion. So I'm thinking they must not have tested the page. We're now like 5 minutes into a 20-minute office hour, right? And I'm thinking this is going to be really awkward, but I don't know how to finish the meeting any other way. So I said, well, are you sure you tested it? Yeah, we definitely tested it. I'm thinking they didn't, but I don't know how else to get through this. So I was like, well, let's go ahead and pull your page up and we'll try it out. So they did. They pulled up the page. They filled out the form. But before they even could get there, I didn't need to have them test the page at all because they called it a landing page. But a more accurate description would be landing pages, plural, because it was 3 pages long of scrolled in text. It was a white page, black font, basically unstyled font, paragraphs and paragraphs of text. And then at the bottom, if you were just a glutton for punishment and you scrolled all the way to the bottom, it was kind of that circa 1999 unstyled web form, right? And so I'm thinking, this is crazy. And so I say, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll help them remember how crazy this is by talking about the beige versus off-white. So I say to the entrepreneurs, hey, you remember that conversation about beige versus off-white tissue paper? Yeah. And you can't make this up. That's why entrepreneurs are amazing. I'm an entrepreneur myself, and so I'm making fun of my own kind here, but why they're absolutely amazing. They start scrolling to a paragraph they have about how they have a genetic algorithm to help you pick the right colors for your wedding, the right color palettes for your wedding. It's like, no. Wrong thing. First of all, that's a feature, not a benefit, but that is far from the problem we need to focus on right now. I said, would your now wife, have wanted to use a tool that looks like this to help her plan her wedding? And the color drained from both of their eyes, or both their faces, I'm sorry. I mean, they were just like, shoot, because what they had built was not a minimally viable product. What they'd built was a minimally crappy product. And the problem is when you build a minimally crappy product, what you learn is that people don't like crappy products. But the problem is you don't need to build a minimally crappy product to learn the people don't like crappy products. You know this. So going back to the definition that we had earlier here of what you're building, right? You're learning nothing about customers. So any amount of effort is wasted effort, right? So viable doesn't equal crappy. Okay, that's sort of point number one on this. Second, and now we're just going back to the other misconceptions here. Second, an MVP is not a destination. Wearing my investor hat for a moment, the number of entrepreneurs who have pitched me and said, like, I want you to invest $250,000 so I can build an MVP, right? And that implies that like there's not an MVP and then an MVP. An MVP is not a destination. An MVP is a map, right? It shows you where you're heading. And each time you go through one of those build, measure, learn cycles, a little bit more of the map gets exposed. And so that's where combining points 1 and 2, that's where I've stopped calling these MVPs and started calling them MAPs, where A stands for awesome. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out what's the minimum amount of functionality I can build, but build it in an awesome way so that I can learn these things about my customers. And with this context now, we'll come back to this later, but then each map you can say, okay, here's what I'm building, here's how a customer will interact with it, here's what I hope to learn, and here's the dollars that it will cost me to flesh this out. And so you can do MAP1, follow that with another one, right? Sometimes you'll validate things, sometimes you won't validate the learning objective, so you need to do another MAP at that. But you can just kind of sequentially step through that there. I can't see any of you, so I'm hoping this is making sense. Again, if there are questions or comments, please post those in the group chat or use the raise hand functionality if you want to chat. I just want to make sure we're talking about the kinds of things you want. But let's keep going here. The next thing is that your MAP should validate or invalidate critical hypotheses about your business. Just a note, those critical hypotheses, remember Dave's lecture, they tend to be, does anybody want what you're building? So you should not build an MVP and if I say, or an MAP, and if I say, well, what are you trying to prove with this? Well, I'm proving that I can build what I have in mind, right? Oh no, that's not what you're validating, right? What you're validating is, something about your customers, because at the early points, that's where your key hypotheses live. And I see we've got a question in the chat. It came in a bit late and I didn't catch what MVP stands for, right? It's minimally viable product. If you watched Dave's Connects workshop, you would have seen the lean startup methodology where we talk about build, measure, learn. What you're building is that MVP. A next one is it doesn't have to be a product at all, right? People tend to get focused on the word product, right? Like, well, I need to have a functioning product. No, you're going to see today there's a lot of MVPs you can do before you write your first line of code. Let's see. So let's see. So unrelated MVP. Yes, exactly. So Roz has a comment. Unrelated to MVP, by the right choice of words, they could go from I don't care about the color to I trust your taste on this, and avoid making that unnecessary startup. But now it brings me to thinking that a tool to help couples communicate could be useful. That's probably true, Roz. For people who are married, I think you'll get some validation on that. Healthy communication between couples is incredibly important and incredibly awesome when it's working. The last one is that it's not always the landing page. This is really much more of a for CMU misunderstanding. We tend, in my experience working with CMU entrepreneurs for the last 10 years, we tend to really love product-based MVPs that are landing pages, I think because it gives us a bunch of data, and we like data, we like the ability to analyze data. It doesn't always have to be a landing page as well, although certainly sometimes that is. Okay, so with that backdrop on the sort of misconceptions on MVPs or the misunderstandings on MVPs, I want to talk now about 4 MAPs you can build before you write a line of code or before you write any sort of meaningful code, because the landing pages, you can do that through a lot of services today. So the concept here is, how can you learn a lot about your customers with a little bit of effort? Remember, that's the definition we're using here. And this is also important for many of you on this workshop, how can you do it before some of you may not yet have a technical co-founder? And a common question is, well, how am I going to recruit a technical co-founder to it? The reality is, what I found is the best way to help get other people excited about your idea is to show them how many customers care about your idea. And all 4 of these are things you can do before you actually write a line of code. Now, I should say, when we're talking about this, all 4 of these as well are not prescriptive. I am not saying that you should start with a storyboard, then do a landing page, then do a demo video, then do a Wizard of Oz. I'm not saying always do all 4 of them. I'm not saying do them in this order. I'm not saying that these are the right things for all of you to build. These are just examples. These are examples of what you could build, but let's walk through each of these. I'm just going to take a drink of water quickly. Okay, storyboards. And again, I'll keep an eye on the chat. I'll keep an eye on raising hands. So if you have things you want to talk about that aren't this, please direct me. I can really talk about just about anything. Some of you I see are familiar names on here. You know that. So I'm happy to take this in any direction you want as well. Okay, but storyboards. So storyboards are this series of sketches that talk about what it's like right before you use the product, what it's like during the use of the product, and what it's like right after you're done using the product or service, that you can hold up like a mirror to get your customers to give you feedback, right? So let's think about this. So it's a mirror. What I mean by this, one of the things that's tricky about doing interviews, and I know first of all, I should say, and I should have said this up front, I'm a big fan of doing interviews. The only reason I don't spend a lot of time talking about doing interviews in this workshop is I know Dave already talked about doing interviews in his Lean Startup Connect series. So please, please, please do interviews up front. While there is no prescripted order, in general, I'd be hard pressed to think of a startup that wouldn't benefit with the first step being going out and interviewing 5 customers. So doing interviews is incredible. But at some point, you're going to need to transition from what people say they're going to do to what they actually do. And I find these storyboards, they're an interesting middle ground here, because they encourage people to be a bit more honest, because you're holding something up and you're saying, is this a reflection of how you look at the world, right? And based on their reaction to that, you can then respond accordingly and adjust accordingly, right? So you get this sort of much higher honest feedback. The other thing is, it doesn't look like you spend a bunch of time on it. It's honestly much easier for people to be critical of rough sketch storyboard ideas than working products. And then finally, I've yet to find an entrepreneur who fell in love with their storyboard. I found lots of entrepreneurs who fell in love with their idea and the product that they built, that kind of thing. So that's storyboards. I want to go through an example here. Again, I would love, I know that we're all Zoom fatigued out here, so I have no issues with you guys having your cameras off, but any kind of feedback in the chat, or like, hey, I'd like to talk about this or that, would be awesome. Let me give you an example though. So this is from TurboTax, and this is from South by Southwest a number of years ago. But TurboTax had this challenge from their senior leadership, which was, hey, why don't we build an app? This was a number of years ago when every company needed to have their own app strategy, right? There's an app for this, there's an app for that, right? Let's absolutely build apps for everything, right? And so one of the TurboTax executives was like, hey, we should build an app for doing our taxes, because doing taxes on your laptop isn't painful enough. Let's shrink the screen and get rid of the keyboard. Just a terrible idea. But people get excited about tech trends. Today, it probably wouldn't be an app. Today, it might be, well, what's our big data strategy, right? And sometimes apps were magical. Let's think about Uber. And sometimes big data is magical. But rarely is the tech trend what drives the customer need. What's interesting though is I think if they'd written an app right off the bat and then they'd gone out and shown it to customers, customers would have told them things like, well, this is, interesting, something along those lines, right? But because they did a storyboard first, they were able to get really quality feedback. And so what they did is they went out and they showed it to customers. They showed them this storyboard, right? So the idea is, and you can see here, the first panel is like, wow, we should work on our taxes tonight. Okay, well, let me go to the iTunes store and download the TurboTax app. Turns out, I am sorry, a keyboard wants to jump to the end of the deck instead of jumping to the next slide. So that turns out not to be the right problem. Also, nobody wants to actually do their taxes on their iPhone. Again, probably not surprising, but you have to remember what year this was. But what people said is like, hey, but it actually turns out there was that one step in the process here that you described that was really important, which is you talked about how through the app, I could take pictures of my W-2 and all my charitable contributions. It really is a pain to organize all that information. So that would be helpful. So the app pivoted from do your taxes on the app to do your taxes with the app and your laptop together. And that ended up becoming really popular. And if you've noticed over the last few years, every company has this. But because TurboTax introduced that first, and remember, tax season, you basically get one big release cycle a year, they're able to get this massive advantage. We already talked a little bit about landing pages, but just a moment more on these. When you're talking about landing pages, you first of all, you want to make sure your landing page frames things out from the perspective of the user. It should be clear and concise, not pages, but a page. It should be very focused on whatever the action is that you want them to take, and only that. So, I do a lot of work with companies like TurboTax that are trying to do entrepreneurship inside their big companies as well through the Corporate Startup Lab. And one of the things we've seen when we've tried to do landing pages, a lot of companies, is they want to put the landing pages on their corporate website, which includes navigation and a bunch of periphery stuff. Well, that's all clicks that can get in the way of seeing if they like or dislike your idea. So it should be conversion focused. After they convert, you should be able to share it. You should make sure that you do a good job measuring the reaction between the two groups, and everything should be consistent between the two pages except for what you're testing. And you can really get bit here. So I'll give you a personal kind of embarrassing example of this. So I did a landing page test for a business I was building inside of our lab studio. This now would be like 8 or 9 years ago, for a company called Best Rate. And Best Rate was this landing page, was this idea of helping people lock in the price of their fuel. Turned out to be not a great idea for a bunch of reasons, but early on we were trying to figure out messaging and things like that. And so we built this landing page and we were testing conversions between the two. And this weird thing happened, which was we wanted to see if the higher value sort of messaging and feature set would be around saving people money or allowing them to lock in their budgeted expenses. And so we built a landing page between the two, but I couldn't find one image that worked for both of them. And so we had two different stock photography images that we were using. Well, the problem was that the second stock photography image converted much better than the first, independent of the messaging on the page, which ended up teaching us lots of the wrong things. So you want to make sure that even as detailed as what image you use is consistent on the same two pages, because as any growth marketer will tell you, things like what image is on the page matters a lot when it comes down to conversion and conversion rates. Sometimes it's a demo video. I'm not going to play this right now, but again, Allison will share these slides with you later. Great example of this is Dropbox. Sorry, I'm taking so many drinks. I've been talking since 8 a.m. and my throat is just fatiguing, I guess. But anyways, Dropbox. So the problem with Dropbox is when people look at the Dropbox service before it existed, right? So imagine someone like Drew is pitching you on Dropbox before you've ever seen anything like Dropbox. People would quickly draw the wrong analogy because Dropbox was not the first service to allow file sharing, right? So they draw the wrong analogy and then they'd focus on that. And so what Drew did is he made this kind of funny video that he shared with people where he simulated how Dropbox would work by starting and stopping the recording. Now, what's important here is, remember, for every MAP, you should ask yourself what it is, but also how the customer will interact with it and what you're going to learn. When you watch the video, you'll see that the whole video leads you to this last part, which is requesting an invitation to join the beta. His MVP actually starts right when someone fills out that beta at dropbox.com, right? Because the actual customer interaction is the email back and forth. Now, he got 5,000 people to send him an email. That was really helpful from a learning perspective. But that wasn't what he proved. What he proved then was the use cases, how they take advantage of all the things that happened post the email, because now they actually had the right idea of what Dropbox was. The last of the examples we wanted to go through is a Wizard of Oz. And the concept behind a Wizard of Oz is just like the movie Wizard of Oz, you might remember, the person behind the curtain, right? You're implying to customers that you're actually doing something automated when in fact humans are doing it. This is really popular for AI startups for what it's worth, right? So if you're doing an AI startup, you could probably summarize your AI startup as customer gives me some information. I do something which will feel magical to them because you could never do it at scale without humans applying their intelligence to it, but now I'm going to apply AI to it and I give it back to them in an automated fashion. Well, long-term, you want to write software that does that middle step. But often the fastest way to figure that out in the short term is just with humans doing the work, right? And so that's the Wizard of Oz test. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a minute again for any questions, comments, things that you wanted to, because we've sort of gone through the first half of the two questions, right? So the first question was, what do you build, right? And now hopefully you'll never call those MVPs again, you'll call them MAPs. Now that we've talked about that, the second part of this is, well, how do you actually go about building those MAPs? And the answer to there is Agile. So we'll spend a few minutes before the workshop wraps up on that. But before we get to that, anything else that you want to talk about on this first one?
Yeah, Sean, quick question for you. How does, or do you see any differences in how you implement these types of tools or processes for something that's more of like a legacy service? So for example, I have a buddy who's building his tennis coaching business, and he's building a new website, and he wants to be a differentiator in that industry in his region. How would focusing on conversion or some of these other things apply to him potentially?
Yeah, so talk a little bit more about how he wants to be differentiated, Jake.
Yeah, so he's a former pro, so he's like the only pro in the region or person who had a pro career. Everyone else are former PE teachers that just got into coaching.
Sure.
He's also by far one of the youngest. He's 20 years younger than the average other coach, and he wants to be that elite coach. So the next, coaching the next team that's going to go pro, as opposed to just bring your kids down to the courts on Saturday and keep them entertained for a couple hours.
Yeah. So to me that doesn't. So going back to again some stuff from, not to completely repurpose Dave's entire talk, right? But if you think about the startups where this lean startup methodology makes a ton of sense, right? It's where you don't quite know exactly the problem you're trying to solve, nor the right solution for it. My intuition for something like that, like a business where there's lots of tennis coaching businesses that already exist, the business model is probably pretty well understood. The solution, although maybe he's a better coach, it's not like he's trying to move from, in-person lessons to, lessons over video with a piece of software giving the feedback, the initial feedback, instead of a coach, right? So the solution is pretty well known, unlike maybe the example I just gave of the automated coaching or algorithmic coaching. You know, in situations like that, I'm not necessarily sure that you want to think about this iterative build, measure, learn as much as you want to think about just kind of, you know, general optimization questions, right? So, you know, I might, if I were advising you and him, I might advise you guys to spend less time trying to figure out, okay, what's the, you know, what's the right solution here? What's the problem I'm really trying to solve? And I might more spend time doing more like general agile optimization, where I just iterate around the ideal solution for a fairly well-known problem. So I might, you know, find 10 customers who are his target customer group, go interview them about how they picked the tennis coach that they work with. And I might talk to 10 people who don't have a tennis coach, but you think should, and understand why they make those choices. And then I might just try to generally incorporate that into not necessarily just a landing page, but the overall website, start buying some traffic against that, and do kind of the typical entrepreneurial grinding optimization that you go through to figure that out. I think that some sort of an approach like that may make more sense than this kind of classic lean startup approach, for what it's worth. Does that make sense, Jake?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And that's what I was kind of thinking, is it's not necessarily a disruptor, but there's probably techniques that aren't necessarily the classic legacy techniques in that industry that you could apply to stand out.
100%, right? And definitely everything Dave talked about interviews, I would definitely do that. But those interviews, I'd focus more on, you know, your target customer who are working with other coaches, and your target customer who aren't working with anybody, right? And then I would I'd take an agile approach to it, but I'd more just grind through it versus try to invent some new type of coaching, because it doesn't really sound like your friend's vision is, you know, an app for coaching instead of in-person coaching or something like that.
Correct. Yeah. Thanks. That really helps.
Sure. So there's a question from Florian about Dave's Lean Entrepreneurship Connects workshop. That was early. Dave always comes kind of before me in these series of workshops, so I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere. Maybe Allison afterwards, you could just post a link to that here. But it's kind of the general Lean Entrepreneurship workshop that underpins mine and a number of the other workshops through the rest of the series here. Anything else, or we'll move on to Agile quickly?
Sean, I have one question for you. So,
yeah,
in terms of tools, you were talking about storyboards, and I was wondering, is there any convenient storyboard cartoon kind of like apps out there that you can make like an easy video like showing a scenario and saying, hey, this is how our minimal viable product would be applied to the customer segment?
Yeah, so there's a ton. The thing that I would say is less is more. Like, this is going to sound weird, but the less pixel perfect it is, the better. Because if it looks like you've spent a bunch of time building the storyboard, and the storyboard is really amazing, you're losing this benefit of people feeling like, oh, this is early, I can give them this really coarse, broad feedback. But if you go to like if you use like an iPad, go to like any of the app store, like you'll see a bunch of these kind of drawing things. The other thing I've done for some ideas, and again, you want to be careful that you don't get too pixel perfect something back, but you can also outsource a lot of this on Upwork as well, which, you know, there becomes a question of kind of time versus money there. But I found it's often pretty good just to use an Upwork Illustrator to flesh this out with you. I would recommend for storyboards less video, more, you know, illustrations you're walking them through, because you want to give them the talk track yourself and watch their reaction to it, not have them watch a video. The demo videos, and you'll see when Allison shares these slides later, you'll see with the Dropbox video, the demo video is more like pretending like the service is out there using Camtasia to simulate it. That makes sense, Nico?
Yeah, then that does. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Other questions? Like, again, I would much rather answer your questions than just talk at you for the next 15 minutes here. Okay, well, I will talk at you guys for a little bit longer, but I'll keep an eye on the chat here. So what do we mean by Agile, right? If the answer to how do you build this is Agile, the obvious question is, well, what do you mean by Agile? Because as many of you know, business people have completely ruined the term Agile. Agile originally was this group of folks who went to a ski lodge, who had built a bunch of different software projects. And in 2001, they went to the ski lodge and they said, let's look at projects that worked well that we're involved in versus projects that didn't work well that we were involved in. And let's understand the difference between the two. And what came out of it was this Agile manifesto, which said like, hey, we value individual interactions over processes and tools. We value working product over documentation. So they're not saying we don't value documentation. They're saying we value working products over that. And again, this was written in late 2001. I remember because I was at Carnegie Mellon at the time as a research fellow. And what happened from 2001 to basically 2010 is people took this framework and came up with a bunch of methodologies that allowed people to build software in this agile way and get all these benefits from it. And then the rest of the world became aware of it and started saying, okay, well, let's use agile to mean fast. Well, for at least the next 10 minutes, what I mean when I say agile is this, what's on the screen here, right? So why is agile so important for the how you build this? Because you're going to be wrong more than you're right. So what you need to figure out is how quickly can you iterate when you realize you're wrong. And this goes back to your significant other saying, how long till your product makes money? Or the VC saying, how long until you can raise your next round? Remember, the rest of the world doesn't look at startups in terms of build, measure, learn cycles. They look at startups in terms of calendar time. So you need to map these build, measure, learn cycles onto a calendar. And what we found is that Scrum becomes this really interesting methodology as an example of Agile that allows you to really wrap however the engineering process you want to be into this framework that allows you to really predict and answer well this question, how long until my next MAP is going to be done, right? We've used it ourselves. It's used by lots of people. It does not, Scrum does not make building software easy. It just makes it easier, which is an important caveat here. Again, in the interest of time, I won't play this video, but you can click and watch the video there. For what it's worth, he ends up plugging his tool at the end. We found, like, honestly, a Google Sheet is plenty good enough. But I do think this video gives a great overview of Scrum in 10 minutes. So if you're trying to talk this about somebody later, you can do that, or you can show that video with them. The concept behind Scrum is that you have a bunch of items which are the things you want to build. You pull chunks of them off. Those become kind of the release you're working on. You then break those into individual sprints, and you go through a defined unit of time where you work on that for a certain set of time every day, asking yourself, what have I done since the last time we met? What am I going to do before we meet again? And what do I need help solving? And then in roughly every 30 days, you step back and you say, okay, what did we accomplish? What do we still need to work on? You can implement this using lots of tools, but again, this Google Doc template is really, really helpful. There's one concept, just in the interest of time before we wrap up here, that I do want to get to, which is that your backlog is prioritized, but this is where this is the two things I want to talk about is estimates and burn down charts. So one of the key things about Scrum is that all estimates are forward-looking. So if you say, I'm going to do this feature, and you say, I think it's going to take me 10 hours, and then you work on it for 8 hours, you don't automatically just update your estimate to 2 hours. You, at the end of that 8 hours, when you're done for the day, say, how much time do I think I still have left on it? And if you still think you have 4 hours left on it, then you don't update your estimate to 2, you update your estimate to 4. And what you realize is over time, the average decrease in estimates across all the engineers will become very consistent. And so you'll begin to get to a point where over time, you'll probably be optimistic, like you probably won't get 10 hours of work done a day, but you'll get about the same amount of work done each day. And on a forward-looking basis, you begin to get good at predicting, therefore, like, well, if I get about 5 hours of work progress done a day, or 5 hours of velocity, to use a Scrum term, and I've got 50 hours left, that means I've got 10 days of work until I'm ready for, the next chunk of work to work on. And you can plot this graphically using a tool like a burn down chart. But that right there, the velocity and then the amount of work remaining and the rate at which you're getting those done, that helps you answer that question that I set up at the beginning of the workshop, right? How long and how much work do I have remaining? And based on the amount of work remaining, how many more weeks or months do I have until that next milestone that people keep asking me about? And so with that, I will open it up for questions. You can follow me on Twitter and engage me there. I'm also, on the CMU email. Obviously, send me a note if you have specific questions. I have a system to quickly get scheduled 15-minute kind of office hour style meetings through Calendly. Happy to do that as well. And I think we've got about 8 minutes here for any last questions, or you can have 8 minutes of your time back.
Hey, Sean, quick question for you. I know technically anyone can employ Agile, and especially as soon as they're starting to build a product. How frequently, or I guess the question is, at what stage do you typically see a startup starting to get serious about Agile and manage it this way? Is it after they've got like 3 employees, or after they've got seed funding, or?
So I think what it's not like when they do and don't use Agile, Jake. It's more when do they start rolling out the monthly sprint planning and the daily stand-ups where you ask those 3 questions I mentioned every day. That tends to be after the team gets like more than 2 or 3 engineers. But what I would say is even before that, doing your estimates on this forward-looking basis and trying to get a sense what your velocity is still incredibly important. I would encourage you to do that right away.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, if not, Allison, I will hand it back over to you.